I may not see them get a music therapist, but boy, I'm going to bring it up every chance I get so that they know that it could be something really impactful for them. And it falls within that realm of providing trauma-informed care really, really well. So that's just an example from my own life. So I want to talk about tools for doing this. And there are lots of tools out there. I'm just going to highlight 4 today. You know, I don't have all the time in the world to talk about it. Hopefully I'll get through 4. That's what I'm aiming for in the time that I have. So I'm going to talk today about listening, embodying your values, thinking like a designer, and self-care. All right, so I'm going to start with listening because I think that's probably the greatest tool you have at your disposal as an advocate and a leader. The thing about listening is that there are lots of ways to do it. And lots of things that you can pay attention to when you're listening, and lots of things that you can choose not to pay attention to. I'm talking here about listening to understand versus listening with an agenda. And as therapists with that kind of lens, we basically always have an agenda. We listen, but we're also simultaneously thinking about what we're going to say next, how we respond, what we're going to do to help this person. So it's not that having an agenda is bad in any way. It's not like we're out to harm people by having an agenda, because we're typically doing it because we want to help and we want to be the most effective that we can in those interactions. But what it does is it takes some of our attention off of that person. It takes attention off of them and puts it back into us, back internally. And a lot of times when that happens is our brains get like sucked into then our own experience. And we start to even notice less what's happening with the people around us. And when you layer in then, if we're trying to advocate for something we're passionate about, I think we get even more turned inward. And notice others even less, because passion really does that to us. It can almost blind us to someone else's perception or reality. So while we need to kind of tap into our passion, I think we also have to find a way to harness it in such a way that we can use it and really utilize it without it taking over and causing us to not really listen to the people that we're leading, to the people that we're advocating for. So I don't know how many of you have seen the most recent Bowles movie, but I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. So we went ahead and rented it, you know, in our quarantine. It was well worth it because we watched it 3 times in 48 hours. Definitely got our bang for the buck. But in that movie, and I encourage you to see it because I think it's delightful. I love the trolls, and this one is great because there's so many different types of music in it. But at a really critical moment, one of the characters points out to Queen Poppy that she is only listening to what she wants to hear. She's only paying attention to that which supports her own opinions and her own perspective. And that's a real temptation as a leader. It's also temptation, I think, in any kind of communication we're having with another person. It's related to a type of bias called confirmation bias. And what confirmation bias is we tend to favor things that confirm our already existing beliefs. So we pay more attention to the stuff that aligns with what we already believe to be true. We're primed to see that. We're primed to agree with it if it fits our preconceptions. And then we tend to ignore or dismiss the things that conflict with them. I've actually caught myself doing this recently with all the coronavirus information. There are certain people who I will not listen to, even though they may have valid information, but I don't know because I'm not going to listen to them. But I think we all have fallen into that trap at one time or another. So under this heading of listening, we also need to include understanding and responding to our personal biases. We all have bias. It's normal. It's innate. We can't necessarily control our biases. They can change or alter somewhat over time based on our experiences, but usually we don't pay a lot of attention to that. However, even though we're not paying attention to them, our bias is influencing every single thought we have and every single behavior as we interact with others. It translates into that behavior. So fortunately, we do have the power to identify and resist those biases. And that's really, I think, where a lot of our power for advocacy and leadership resides. But it takes practice. If you haven't had an opportunity to do any kind of work examining your own implicit bias, I strongly encourage you to do that. I think it's an essential piece of being a caregiver of some kind. You know, we're music therapists or music therapy students, and we're doing caregiving work for others in that role. So taking some time to examine that. A good starting point is the implicit bias test that they're running a study at Harvard. It's kind of an ongoing thing, but you can get online and participate in that. It seems fun when you're doing it because you get to, like, you know, match things up and pick different things. You have to do it really quick. But then at the end you get, you know, like a report out of what your bias is, and then it becomes not so fun anymore. But it's really valuable information. So you can get to that by going to implicit.harvard.edu. Maybe I can get somebody to type that in the chat. Implicit with an I. And then a great book to read also is Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. She is a social psychologist, and she has done, she has done a lot of research around the kind of the implications of bias, and also the brain mechanisms, the patterns that are happening in our brains when we're engaged in judgment and bias. So it's really, really valuable. Jennifer Eberhardt, E-B-E-R-H-A-R-D-T, Eberhardt. And the book is called Biased, B-I-A-S-E-D. There's lots of other good books out there too, but that's one that I just have really found to be valuable. I also want to point out the complexity of bias. I think because of where we are culturally right now, a lot of the discussion of bias is really related to race and gender identity, sexual preference, religion, income, other privileges. And those are, of course, like super important to consider. They influence a lot of policy decisions and social decisions that are happening. And we definitely need to take those into account. But bias also happens on a more individual level and might also look like the way we assume that someone else's behavior is because of their character. But our own behavior is because of the situation. And that's called a fundamental attribution error. I'm going to throw a lot of terms at you. So if my coworker is late, for instance, I'm likely to think that she can't get it together. It's some character flaw that she has, that she can't make it to work on time. But if I'm late, I'm more likely to blame like the traffic or the weather or my children or what other, rather than acknowledge my own contribution to why I'm late. Some other biases I think that are important for us to consider, especially when we're making decisions about something. There's something called the sunk cost bias. We tend to hold on to things that we've already invested a lot of time or money or energy into, even if they no longer serve us. We will cling to those because we feel like we're going to miss out on what we've already on what value we've already given to it. So we kind of overestimate the value of those things. That's why it's hard for us to clean out our closets and let go of clothes that we haven't worn in a really long time because we already bought them. So we don't want to get rid of them. That's a really simple example. And when it comes to advocacy, I think a trap is the curse of knowledge, which sounds very daunting, but really that's just about how once we know something or once we understand something, we presume that it's obvious to everybody else too. And we make that assumption that, well, everybody else ought to understand this because I understand it, but that's not always true. And I think that's really important when we're trying to advocate and trying to lead. So to tie all of that back into listening, when we recognize how our bias influences the way we understand someone else, it helps us be able to empathize more effectively because it keeps us out of judgment. The next thing I want to highlight then under listening is the practice of empathy. And I'm calling it the practice of empathy on purpose because when we feel empathy for someone else in their situation, that's an emotional response. And that's really tightly wound in with our bias. We can really, like our brains are sort of set up to only emotionally empathize most strongly with someone who with someone who looks like me. So really with someone to the point where it like intersects with our own experience. So someone who looks like me, who has a similar role as me, similar belief systems, like those kinds of things. That's how our brains are sort of wired. And that's why understanding empathy and bias is so important, because if we're making a lot of decisions based just on emotional empathy, we're not really considering how those decisions might impact other people who are not like us. And when we start to do that, that's where discrimination happens. That's where oppression happens at a greater level. So my call to action for you today is to start practicing compassionate empathy. And it's not really easy, but at least there's some steps that you can follow. And I put them on the slides. So here's how you can practice compassionate empathy. And it starts with actively listening. We're listening to understand, not with an agenda. So what that means is we have to like calm our brains down a little bit and really focus, practicing some mindfulness skills, focusing in on what the person is saying and listening beyond the words as well. And then staying out of judgment, recognizing the impact that our bias has on our judgment of another person and their situation. And that's important because when we get judgy, we actually trigger our own stress response. When we trigger our own stress response, that pulls us out of our like cognitive thinking part of our brain and into our brainstem and our stress response, our limbic system. And then we're not really listening at all anymore. We've just sucked ourselves into that stress response. So staying out of judgment helps us stay present with another person. And then that in turn allows us to really explore the other person's perspective, again, without judgment. We're looking at, we acknowledge our bias in that, but also try to understand what is life like for them right now. What is their experience? Asking what happened that has led them to this belief or this feeling. That's a trauma-informed care question. What happened to you? Instead of the judgy question that we usually do, which is, what is wrong with them? And when we say what is wrong, that adds a lot of shame and judgment into their world. That's not a helpful experience. And then what we do next is identify the person's feelings, trying to name the feeling, even if we're just doing that in our own minds. That helps us be able to start to understand. And we might be wrong, and that's okay. It's about exploring. It's about being curious around what their experience is, and then provide some validation, especially if they're hurting. I think this practice of compassionate empathy, all of the tools really are helpful if a person is in pain of some sort, or pain could be sadness, anger, any of those kind of strong feelings. And then letting the person know that they're not alone, or letting them know that they are heard. I think that's what most of us want more than anything, is to know that somebody else heard me. You don't have to fix it for me. You don't have to try to make it better. I just need to know that you are with me and that you're not going to leave me alone. I think that's a really essential part of who we are as human beings. So this practice of empathy is also protective for you, because emotional empathy is draining. If you empathize on the emotional level with every person that you come in contact with, your own limbic system will get so overwhelmed with all of those feelings that it becomes really difficult to know anymore where your own feelings are, even in that. You can actually kind of lose your identity in that continued emotional empathy. And I think that's especially true if you are someone who is a more empathetic person to begin with. But then if you're in an environment where you're with a lot of people who are suffering in some way, like that can add on to the experience as well.